Clear the bay. We're running out of time.
Don't worry, I've got you. We're almost safe.
Every species in the Kesh Compact remembers the Vantor collapse differently, but they all remember it beginning the same way, with a distress call nobody expected to survive answering and a response from a species nobody had bothered to invite. The official Compact record calls it a humanitarian deployment. The survivors of Vantor Prime call it something else, in a dozen different languages, and none of those names translate cleanly into anything the Compact archives are willing to print. This is the story of what actually happened in the 11 days before the world ended, and the 9 that came after, when the only ships that answered the call were not warships at all. No Compact record has ever fully explained why the human relay stations along that stretch of border space maintained a standing protocol for a threshold no other minor power bothered to define, or why an office as quietly funded as Threshold Response existed at all, years before anyone official on Earth would admit, on the record, that such an office was anything more than a logistics contingency. The answer, when it finally surfaced decades later in a set of declassified founding charters, turned out to be almost disappointingly simple, and considerably more human than anyone expecting a grand strategic explanation was prepared for. It begins on a mining platform called Kesh Station 9, 4 hours before the first tremor. Foreman Tail Eyes Bren had worked the deep core rigs on Vantor Prime for 22 years, long enough to know the difference between a normal seismic groan and something the planet had never done before. The tremor that hit at 3:40 platform time did not match any pattern in the station's geological database, and the automated alerts that should have followed within seconds instead took 4 full minutes to trigger, because the system that generated them had never been designed for a fault line splitting open at the speed this one was splitting. By the time Bren got a clear reading, the crack ran 200 kilometers and was still growing, venting superheated gas from a magma chamber that geological surveys, filed a century earlier by a Compact team in more of a hurry than they should have been, had confidently rated as stable for at least another 10,000 years. Vantor Prime was not a Compact member world. It was a border colony, settled 2 centuries earlier by a coalition of minor species too small individually to hold a Compact seat, banding together on a marginal, resource-rich planet nobody more powerful had wanted badly enough to claim first. 4 million people lived there, spread across a dozen mixed-species settlements, protected by exactly 1 aging defense cruiser and a mutual aid treaty with 3 neighboring systems that had never actually been tested by anything worse than a bad storm season. When Bren's emergency broadcast went out on every frequency the station could reach, it traveled a long way before anyone powerful enough to help was listening. The Kesh Compact had existed in one form or another for nearly 6,000 years, a slow accretion of treaties and mutual defense pacts among species who had learned, mostly through catastrophic early wars, that cooperation was cheaper than conquest in the long run. Membership came with real benefits: shared defense infrastructure, coordinated trade routes, access to a deep well of accumulated scientific knowledge. But it also came with a hierarchy that smaller, newer, or less strategically useful worlds felt keenly every time a crisis exposed exactly how far down the priority list their survival actually sat. Vantor Prime's founding coalition had applied for associate status twice in its 2-century history, and been quietly declined both times, on the technical grounds that no single member species in the coalition met the minimum population threshold required for individual sponsorship, and no provision existed in Compact law for sponsoring a coalition of species collectively. It was a bureaucratic technicality that had never mattered much in peacetime, and mattered enormously the moment the ground began to open beneath 4 million people who had built their lives assuming, reasonably, that a treaty 6,000 years in the making would find some way to help them if it ever truly needed to. The Compact's nearest fleet asset, a logistics carrier 6 days out, filed a priority assessment and concluded, correctly by every metric its doctrine recognized, that Vantor Prime's population could not be evacuated in time by any vessel currently in range. The assessment did not recommend attempting a rescue. It recommended, in the flat, bloodless language every species in the compact had learned to read between the lines of, beginning the process of memorializing a world that had not yet finished dying. 4 hours after Talais Bren's first tremor reading, a human relay station on the far edge of the compact's charted space picked up the same disters. Z's call, 40 minutes after every closer power had already logged it as unrecoverable. Humanity, at that point in galactic history, held no compact seat and wanted none. It had been formally contacted 18 years earlier, verified as a minor spacefaring power, and largely ignored ever since. In the specific way the compact ignored civilizations too new to be dangerous and too poor to be useful. What the compact's assessment reports never mentioned, mostly because nobody had bothered asking, was that human relay stations along the border ran a standing protocol that had nothing to do with compact treaties at all. Any verified distress call above a certain casualty threshold triggered an automatic alert to a small, permanently staffed coordination office on Earth that existed for exactly one purpose, and had existed, in one form or another, for longer than most compact diplomats realized humanity had even possessed interstellar flight. The office was called Threshold Response. Its director, a soft-spoken logistics veteran named Amara Odom, received the Vantor Prime alert at 4:26 her local time and had the first response wing moving within 11 minutes, a speed that would later become the single most quoted detail in every compact inquiry into what happened next. She did not send warships because Threshold Response did not operate any. She sent 4 vessels designed for exactly one task, refined across decades of quiet deployments most of the galaxy had never heard about because none of them had ever happened anywhere a compact observer was watching. The Halcyon, the Meridian's Word, the Long Watch, and a smaller, faster ship called the First Light, whose sole cargo was 70 trained rescue specialists and enough portable stabilization equipment to hold a dying world together for exactly as long as it took the larger ships to arrive behind it. She did not send warships because Threshold Response did not operate any. She sent 4 vessels designed for exactly one task, refined across decades of quiet deployments most of the galaxy had never heard about because none of them had ever happened anywhere a compact observer was watching. The Halcyon, the Meridian's Word, the Long Watch, and a smaller, faster ship called the First Light, whose sole cargo was 70 trained rescue specialists and enough portable stabilization equipment to hold a dying world together for exactly as long as it took the larger ships to arrive behind it. Odom herself had joined Threshold Response 26 years earlier, in its considerably smaller and less capable early form, following a career in disaster logistics that began, unglamorously, coordinating flood relief across a set of coastal regions on Earth that no longer existed in their original geography by the time she was 40. She had watched the organization grow from a handful of overworked volunteers running supply drops to isolated settlements too small for any government's formal attention, into something closer to a standing institution, funded through a quiet patchwork of public appropriation and private endowment that successive Earth governments had learned, mostly by staying out of its way, not to interfere with too closely. She had never once, in 26 years, denied a verified distress call above threshold, and she was not about to let a planet's lack of compact standing become the first exception on her watch. The compact logistics carrier's captain, a methodical Ashkar officer named Veldorath, logged the human deployment with open skepticism the moment his sensors picked it up 3 hours later, because nothing in his doctrine explained why any rational power would commit real resources to a world with no strategic value, no compact standing, and by his own carrier's projection, no realistic chance of the population surviving intact regardless of who arrived to help. He filed his skepticism formally, as officers of his species were trained to do, and continued toward Vantor Prime anyway, because even a hopeless rescue attempt was, in Ashkar doctrine, worth documenting for the historical record. His skepticism was not, in fairness, unusual for an officer of his service record. Ashkar doctrine had been built across 3,000 years of increasingly formalized warfare, refined into a discipline that valued predictability above almost every other operational virtue, and nothing about a minor power committing its full available emergency capacity to a non-member world matched any predictable pattern his training recognized. He had reviewed, in the hours before making planetfall himself, every prior recorded interaction between human vessels and compact assets, a thin file that amounted to little more than routine trade clearances and a handful of unremarkable diplomatic exchanges, none of which had prepared him for what his sensors were now reporting. He drafted in the privacy of his own quarters a preliminary assessment suggesting the human deployment might be a publicity exercise, a calculated bid for compact attention dressed up as altruism, because that explanation at least fit a framework his career had equipped him to understand. He deleted the draft 6 hours later, after his own sensor logs made the theory impossible to sustain. Nobody staged a publicity exercise by accepting documented, repeated risk of serious injury to their own personnel, in a system with no compact media presence to witness any of it. What he documented instead, over the following 11 days, would end his career, rewrite 3 chapters of compact emergency response doctrine, and leave him standing on the surface of a half-collapsed world beside a species he had arrived expecting to pity. The first light reached Vantor Prime 19 hours after the initial tremor, a full 2 days before Dorothy's carrier, having taken a transit route through a region of charted but unpatrolled space that compact navigational doctrine considered too risky for anything but emergency traffic. The specialists aboard did not wait for the ship to fully dock before beginning triage, deploying through a mining platform's cargo airlock in a sequence so rehearsed it looked, to the handful of surviving station crew who witnessed it, less like an emergency response and more like a dance nobody outside the team had ever been taught the steps to. Tailey's Bren, still alive, still coordinating what remained of his crew from a control room slowly losing pressure, watched the first human specialist come through the airlock and felt something he would later struggle to describe to compact investigators without sounding, in his own words, unprofessionally emotional. The specialist did not ask who was in charge. She looked at the room, read the casualty triage board someone had scrawled by hand on a bulkhead, and began issuing instructions in accented but fluent trade cant before her boots had fully cleared the airlock threshold, moving with the specific, unhurried efficiency of someone who had clearly done this exact kind of impossible thing enough times before that the impossibility itself no longer registered as anything worth pausing over. Her name, according to the station's surviving logs, was Specialist First Class Rosa Delgado, team lead for the First Light's forward triage unit, and she had personally led rescue operations on 11 prior worlds across 9 years of service, none of which any compact record had ever formally documented, because none of them had happened anywhere a compact vessel had been present to notice. Delgado had joined Threshold Response at 19, recruited not through any formal military pipeline, but through a quieter civilian program that specifically sought out people with backgrounds in emergency medicine, structural engineering, and disaster psychology, on the theory that a rescue specialist needed to understand a crisis from the inside of the human body outward, not merely from a tactical map downward. Her training had included 18 months of fieldwork on Earth's own remaining disaster-prone regions before she was ever cleared for off-world deployment. A deliberate choice by the program's designers to ensure every specialist had already personally carried someone out of a collapsing structure before they were ever asked to do it light years from any backup. She had told exactly one interviewer years later what she remembered thinking in the moment she stepped through the First Light's airlock onto Kesh Station 9's failing platform, and the answer had surprised even the interviewer expecting something more dramatic. I wasn't thinking about the mission or the compact or any of it. I was thinking about Foreman Bren's daughter, whose name I'd memorized off the crew manifest during transit, because somewhere under all that noise was a real person who needed someone to already know who she was looking for before I ever set foot inside. The fault line beneath Vantor Prime continued widening through the first night, venting gas plumes that reached altitudes no atmospheric model had predicted. And by the time the Halcyon and Meridian's word arrived 26 hours later, the planet's largest settlement, a mixed-species city called Corvin Hollow, sat directly in the path of a pyroclastic surge that every projection agreed would reach the outer districts within 31 hours. Amara Odom, monitoring the operation from Earth through a relay lag of nearly 6 minutes each direction, made the call that compact investigators would spend the following 2 years arguing over in closed hearings. Rather than evacuate what could realistically be saved and accept the rest as unavoidable loss, Threshold Response would attempt a full population extraction of Corvin Hollow's 400,000 residents in the 31 hours available, using equipment and personnel numbers that, by every compact logistics model run afterward, should not have made the deadline. By a margin of at least 6 hours. She did not explain the decision to anyone above her in any formal chain of command, because Threshold Response, by design, answered to almost no one fast enough to matter in a window this narrow. She simply gave the order, and 70 specialists who had trained for exactly this kind of impossible arithmetic began finding a way to make the numbers work anyway. Veldorith's carrier arrived at the edge of the system on the second day, and what his sensors showed him did not match anything in his own doctrine's category of humanitarian response. 4 vessels operating as a single coordinated system, moving evacuation convoys through terrain his own carriers' survey teams would have flagged as impassable without at least a week of preliminary mapping. Ground teams establishing shelter zones in locations his atmospheric models insisted were still within the surge's projected reach, a choice that made no tactical sense to him until he understood hours later that the humans were not choosing shelter locations based on safety margins at all. They were choosing them based on how many additional people they could physically walk to before the deadline, and accepting a narrower personal safety margin themselves in exchange for a wider reach. He requested formal contact with the Operations Field Command, expecting, based on every prior interaction his career had prepared him for, some measure of the careful diplomatic hedging smaller powers typically extended toward compact officers. What he got instead was a field coordinator named Marcus Ilori, exhausted, filthy, missing sleep for going on 30 hours, who answered Dorith's formal inquiry with a directness that briefly stunned the Ashkar officer into silence. "We don't have time for a briefing, Captain. If your carrier has medical bays and cargo capacity you're not using for anything more urgent, get them moving toward these coordinates in the next 20 minutes, or get out of the flight corridor. Because we have people who are going to die in the next 6 hours if we spend one more of them explaining ourselves to someone who showed up 2 days late." Dorith, for reasons he would spend the following months trying to fully articulate to himself, did not lodge the formal protest his training told him the exchange warranted. He redirected his medical bays within 11 minutes. The first major setback came on the third day, when a secondary fault opened beneath the evacuation route connecting Corvin Hollow's eastern district to the primary shelter zone, collapsing a transit tunnel that had been carrying nearly a third of the extraction traffic and trapping an estimated 600 people, mostly elderly and mobility-impaired residents who had been moved through the tunnel specifically, because it offered the gentlest grade for those unable to walk the surface route quickly. Rosa Delgado's team reached the collapse 18 minutes after it happened, and the assessment her senior engineer delivered on arrival was blunt in the way only someone genuinely trying to save lives has the discipline to be. The tunnel's remaining structure would hold for approximately 4 hours before a secondary collapse. The trapped population's air reserves would last roughly 3, and reopening a safe extraction path through the rubble by any standard method would take at minimum 7. Delgado did not accept any of those numbers as final, because threshold response training had taught her, across 9 years of impossible arithmetic, that standard methods were a starting assumption rather than a ceiling. She reorganized her team into 3 simultaneous extraction approaches instead of one sequential effort, accepting a threefold increase in resource strain and a real risk of exhausting her equipment before any single approach succeeded, because a coordinated failure across 3 fronts still reached the trapped population faster than a clean success on one front alone, if the math worked out even slightly in her favor. It was a gamble built entirely on the same principle Marcus Ilori had shown Dorothy on the surface: narrower margins for the rescuers, wider reach for everyone else. It nearly did not work. The lead extraction tunnel her team cut collapsed 40 minutes before completion, injuring 2 specialists and costing the team nearly an hour they did not have. Delgado redirected the remaining effort without pausing to grieve the setback, because grieving, she would later tell compact investigators in the only interview she ever gave on the subject, was a luxury that belonged to the time after the deadline, not before it. The trapped population came out with 11 minutes of breathable air remaining, all 600 alive, 4 specialists requiring emergency medical evacuation of their own by the time the last survivor cleared the rubble. Among the 600 pulled from the collapsed transit tunnel was a woman named Ewan Castra, 81 years old, who had spent the 3 hours of trapped darkness holding the hand of a stranger's child separated from her parents in the initial panic, murmuring old songs in a language the girl did not speak, but seemed, by every account Castra gave afterward, to find steadying anyway. When Delgado's team finally reached them, Castra refused evacuation ahead of the child, insisting through an interpreter that the girl be carried out first, a small act of stubbornness that cost Castra nearly 11 additional minutes of waiting in air that had, by then, grown thin enough to make her lightheaded. She was reunited with the girl's parents 4 days later at the northern shelter zone, in a moment neither Delgado nor any of her team had engineered or even known to expect, having simply logged both survivors under standard family tracing protocol and moved on to the next emergency. Castra kept, for the rest of her life, a small strip of fabric torn from the girl's jacket that day, the same rough-colored cloth system Deshan Okafor would later adopt more formally for the orphaned children at Corvain Hollow's northern shelters, though neither of them ever learned the idea had passed between them at all. A second, quieter crisis unfolded in parallel through the 4th and 5th days, one that never made any compact inquiry's headline findings, but which several of the specialists present would later describe as the hardest stretch of the entire operation. The stabilization camp's medical stores, calculated to support the original evacuation timeline, began running critically short of a specific class of trauma medication, as casualty numbers from the tunnel collapse and subsequent structural failures outpaced every projection. A senior medic named Dr. Inez Solari faced, on the evening of the 4th day, a triage decision no training fully prepares a person to make cleanly. With supplies sufficient for perhaps 60% of the patients requiring them, she had to determine in real time which 60% stood the best chance of surviving with treatment, and which would have to wait for a resupply run that might not arrive before the decision became irrelevant either way. She made the calls methodically, recording each one in a private log she kept not for any official record, but because she had decided early in her career that a decision this heavy deserved to be remembered honestly rather than smoothed over afterward. 12 of the patients she was forced to deprioritize survived anyway, through some combination of resilience and improvised care from specialists working with what remained. 3 did not, and Solari attended every one of their memorial services personally over the following decade, whenever her own deployment schedule allowed her to return to Vantor Prime at all, a private ritual she never explained to anyone and never once skipped. It was this incident, more than any single statistic from the broader operation, that compact analysts would later cite as the moment they stopped being able to explain human behavior using any existing framework for how minor spacefaring powers were supposed to allocate risk. No compact doctrine authorized rescuers to accept a documented, near-certain chance of their own serious injury in exchange for a marginal improvement in extraction speed. Human doctrine, whatever threshold response actually called it internally, appeared to treat that exact trade as the entire point. The full scale of the extraction effort became clear to Dorith on the fourth day, when he finally reviewed the coordination logs Amara Odom's team had, almost as an afterthought, granted him limited access to as part of the joint response. What he found was not a single organization improvising heroically under pressure, though it looked that way from the ground. It was a system refined across what the logs suggested were decades of quiet, undocumented deployments, in which every specialist, every vessel, every piece of equipment operated according to a shared doctrine so deeply internalized that almost none of the coordination required active command decisions at all. People simply knew the way a body knows how to catch itself when it stumbles, what their role required of them in a given crisis, and moved to fill it without waiting to be told. He asked Marcus Ilori, during one of the rare 10-minute breaks the field coordinator allowed himself, how a species with no compact seat, no significant military reputation, and by every metric his carrier's intelligence briefings had ever compiled, a comparatively young interstellar program, had built something this sophisticated without any compact observer ever noticing. Ilori's answer, delivered through the specific flatness of someone too tired to soften an uncomfortable truth, reframed the entire operation for Dorith in a single sentence. Because nobody in your compact ever bothered watching what we actually spent our resources on. Captain, you were all too busy deciding we weren't dangerous enough to matter. Turns out that's also exactly the amount of attention it takes to miss the fact that we've been doing this, quietly, on every world too small or too poor for your compact to bother saving, for longer than most of your officers have been alive. The mid-crisis revelation that reframed the entire operation arrived on the sixth day, when Odom's geological team, cross-referencing real-time seismic data against the century-old compact survey that had originally rated the fault system stable, identified an anomaly that made the entire disaster look considerably less like an accident of geology and considerably more like a consequence someone should have seen coming decades earlier. The original survey, filed by a compact team working under a tight resource extraction timeline, had used seismic modeling that deliberately underweighted a specific class of deep fault instability, because accurately modeling it would have required equipment and time the survey's budget had not allocated. The resulting report, technically accurate within its stated methodology, had nonetheless given Vantor Prime's settlers a stability rating that a more thorough survey, conducted with the equipment the original team had access to but chose not to use, would almost certainly have flagged as dangerously optimistic. Dorith, reviewing the comparison Odom's team compiled and forwarded through official channels rather than leaking it, as several of his own officers privately urged him to do, understood immediately what it meant for his own compact's culpability in the disaster unfolding around him. A century-old cost-cutting decision, made by a survey team answering to a resource extraction timeline rather than a settler safety mandate, had quietly set the conditions for 4 million people to build their lives atop a fault system that had never actually been as stable as they were told. He forwarded the finding to Compact Command with a formal recommendation for immediate independent review, the first genuinely uncomfortable professional decision of his career, and one that would earn him more institutional resentment than the entire rescue operation itself. News of the survey anomaly reached the wider Compact media network within days, filtered through channels considerably less careful than Dorothy's own formal reporting had been, and the resulting coverage split cleanly along lines that surprised almost no one who had watched the Compact respond to prior scandals involving smaller, non-member worlds. Several major outlets focused overwhelmingly on the human rescue effort's dramatic details, running feature coverage on individual specialists that briefly made names like Rosa Delgado and Deshan Okafor recognizable across a dozen systems, while the underlying question of Compact institutional responsibility for the original survey's negligence received a fraction of the attention, buried in policy segments most casual audiences skipped entirely. Amara Odom, watching the coverage from Earth with the specific weariness of someone who had seen this exact pattern play out on prior operations, remarked to her own senior staff that the imbalance did not particularly surprise or trouble her, though it clarified something she had long suspected about why threshold response had never sought recognition in the first place. A galaxy quick to celebrate a rescue and slow to examine why the rescue had been necessary at all was not a galaxy likely to fix the underlying problem regardless of how much attention any single operation received. And chasing that attention, she told her staff, would only ever cost the organization the operational freedom it needed to keep showing up quietly, wherever it was needed next. The emotional core of the operation crystallized on the seventh day, in a shelter zone on Corvin Hollow's northern perimeter, where a specialist named Deshan Okafor spent 11 consecutive hours coordinating the evacuation of a residential complex housing several hundred orphaned and unaccompanied children, separated from their families in the initial chaos and unable, in many cases, to communicate their own names clearly enough for standard identification protocols to process them quickly. Okafor abandoned standard protocol entirely by the third hour, when it became clear that the processing delays it caused were costing more time than the identification accuracy it provided was worth. He organized the children instead by a system of his own improvisation, using colored fabric strips torn from emergency supply kits to group siblings and known friend groups together by sight rather than paperwork, personally carrying the smallest and most frightened children through transit checkpoints himself, rather than delegating the task to processing staff who, however well-trained, were strangers to a child already terrified by everything else happening around her. A Compact relief volunteer working alongside him, a young Vesari aid worker named Corin Is who had never before witnessed a rescue operation up close, asked him at one point, during a rare lull, why he bothered memorizing individual children's names and fears when standard triage protocol explicitly deprioritized that kind of personal engagement in favor of processing speed. Okafor's answer, recorded by Is in a personal journal entry that would later be quoted, without his permission, in a widely circulated Compact human interest piece, became one of the few lines from the entire operation that reached audiences far beyond the Compact's emergency response bureaucracy. Because every one of these kids is going to remember, for the rest of their life, whether the first adult who found them after their world started dying knew their name or just their file number. I can't stop the ground from shaking. I can make sure that when they're 80 years old and telling their grandchildren about the worst week of their life, somewhere in that story is a stranger who bothered to learn who they actually were. The final confrontation, if the word applies to a disaster with no enemy to fight, came on the 9th and 10th days, when the primary fault system, having vented pressure steadily for over a week, entered a phase Odom's geological team had been quietly dreading since the six-day discovery. A rapid, cascading collapse of the entire northern fault network, threatening not merely Corvain Hollow's remaining unevacuated districts, but the shelter zones themselves, hastily established in locations that had been calculated as safe under conditions the new seismic data suggested no longer applied. There was no version of the plan that survived this development cleanly. Odom, informed of the projection with roughly 9 hours of warning before the cascade's estimated onset, faced a decision with no clean answer available. Relocate the shelter zones, accepting the massive logistical strain and genuine risk of losing coordination over a population already exhausted past reasonable limits, or hold position and gamble that the cascade's actual severity would fall within a margin the current shelters could survive. She chose relocation, not because the data clearly favored it, but because Threshold Response's entire operating philosophy, built across decades of exactly these unclear high-stakes calls, held that a species which measured its decisions by the worst version of its own uncertainty, rather than the most convenient one, was a species less likely to look back on its choices with regret it could not undo. The order reached specialists already operating at the outer limits of physical endurance, and more than one team lead later admitted, in post-operation debriefs, that their first private reaction to the relocation order was something close to despair. A junior specialist named Priya Nandakumar, 6 days into her first major off-world deployment and functioning on a cumulative 11 hours of sleep across that entire span, would later describe the moment the order came through as the point at which she genuinely believed the operation was about to fail, not because the plan was wrong, but because she could not imagine her own body finding anything left to give. What she found instead, watching her senior colleagues absorb the same impossible order without visible hesitation and simply begin moving, was a kind of contagious wordless resolve that she could not fully explain afterward, except to say that it felt less like courage and more like habit. The specific muscle memory of people who had done exactly this kind of impossible thing enough times before that their bodies had learned to keep functioning past the point their minds insisted was the limit. She followed their lead not because she felt capable of it, but because everyone around her clearly expected that she was. And she found, to her own quiet astonishment over the following 11 hours, that expectation turned out to be a kind of fuel all its own. The relocation effort that followed, executed by specialists who had by that point been working for 9 consecutive days on rotating exhaustion, was, by every account later compiled, the single most demanding phase of the entire operation, and the one during which the highest number of specialist injuries occurred. It was also, by every metric that mattered, successful. The cascade arrived 11 hours later than projected and considerably more severe than the original models had suggested, destroying the original shelter locations entirely and confirming, in the bleakest possible way, that Odom's decision to relocate had likely saved every life that would otherwise have been lost in those original zones. Veldorith, standing in the newly established shelter perimeter, as the cascade's aftershocks finally began to settle, watched Rosa Delgado's team treat the last wave of injuries from the reloca. Tian effort with the same unhurried, practiced calm they had shown on the very first night, and understood more clearly than any single statistic could have taught him exactly what kind of species he had spent the last week underestimating. He asked her in the relative quiet after the final tremor confirmed the fault system had finally begun to stabilize. What kept a species doing this kind of work, world after world, decade after decade, with no compact recognition, no strategic benefit, and by every account he had gathered minimal support even from their own government beyond the resources threshold response required to keep operating. Delgado, sitting on an overturned supply crate with her hands still trembling faintly from 9 days without adequate rest, gave him an answer that compact historians would eventually cite as the single most quoted line from the entire Vantor Prime disaster. Because we remember what it felt like to be the ones nobody came for, Captain. Before we had ships like this, before we had anything worth sending, humanity spent most of its own history watching disasters happen to itself with nobody outside our own atmosphere able to help even if they'd wanted to. We decided, once we finally could, that we were never going to be the kind of people who let that happen to somebody else if there was any way at all to stop it. It's not a strategy. It's just the only thing that made the last few centuries feel like they meant something. The final casualty count from Vantor Prime, compiled jointly by Compact and human investigators over the following months, listed 141 confirmed deaths out of a pre-disaster population of 4 million, a survival rate that every independent projection run before threshold response's arrival had considered mathematically impossible. 63 of those deaths occurred in the first 4 hours, before any rescue element had reached the surface. The remaining 78 occurred across the following 10 days, each one documented, named, and personally accounted for by a specialist who had been present, in most cases, at the moment it happened. Amara Odom kept a copy of that list for the rest of her career, the same way Compact Records would later note with quiet astonishment. Every prior threshold response director before her had apparently kept lists from every operation stretching back decades, none of which the wider galaxy had ever known to ask about. When a Compact inquiry eventually asked her, on record, why humanity had never sought formal recognition for any of it, why an operation of this scale and sophistication had been allowed to remain functionally invisible to the very Compact whose territory it so often operated within, her answer was shorter than the question seemed to deserve. Because the moment this becomes about being recognized for it, it stops being about the people we're actually there for. We didn't build threshold response to be seen. We built it because somewhere right now, on some world nobody important is watching, someone is about to lose everything, and we decided a long time ago that the answer to that has to be yes every single time, whether anyone ever finds out or not. Vel Dorith's formal report on the Vantor Prime operation, filed 6 weeks after the fault system finally stabilized, ran to 400 pages and recommended a complete overhaul of Compact emergency response doctrine, citing human methodology as the closest working model available. The recommendation was quietly shelved by a review board more interested in protecting a century of prior doctrine than admitting a minor, unaffiliated power had solved a problem the Compact's far larger resources had never managed to solve at all. Dorith resigned his commission 8 months later and joined Threshold Response as a liaison officer, the first non-human ever formally accepted into an organization that, until that point, had never once advertised that it was looking for anyone at all. Corvain Hollow was rebuilt over the following decade, on more carefully surveyed ground, its new central plaza built around a modest, unmarked memorial listing 141 names in no particular order of importance. There is no mention on the memorial of which species saved how many, no accounting of whose resources did the most work, no plaque explaining that the ships which arrived first, stayed longest, and left last belonged to a people the wider galaxy had spent 2 decades considering too small to matter. The survivors who commissioned it decided unanimously that the memorial was for the dead, not for anyone's credit. And that decision, more than any Compact hearing or human interest story, was the truest tribute either species ever managed to give the people who had done the actual work. No formal Compact ceremony ever marked the anniversary of Vantor Prime stabilization, though the survivors themselves began unprom. Ted, gathering each year on the date the final cascade settled, a tradition that continued for decades without ever requiring official sanction from any government on either side. Veldorith attended every one of those gatherings for the rest of his career, standing quietly at the edge of a crowd that had long since stopped treating him as an outsider. And on the 10th anniversary, when a local historian asked him to say a few words for the gathered survivors, he offered a single unscripted line that several attendees would later cite as the moment they finally understood what the whole operation had actually cost the people who ran it. "I came here expecting to document a tragedy. I stayed long enough to learn that the only thing separating a tragedy from a story people survive is whether somebody was willing to show up before it was convenient to." 3 decades later, when a compact historian finally compiled the first comprehensive account of Threshold Response's operations, cross-referencing 4 decades of quietly logged deployments across worlds most of the galaxy had never heard of and never would, the report's closing line borrowed, almost by accident, the same phrase Marcus Ilori had used to Vel Dorith on the third day of the worst week of his career. Earth sent no soldiers to any of those worlds. It sent people who had simply decided, long before anyone was watching, that showing up was never going to be optional, and who kept showing up anyway on world after world, long after the last thing they wanted was anyone's applause for it. The Compact Review Board's decision to shelve Dorith's recommended doctrine overhaul was not, in the years that followed, the end of its consequences. A quiet but growing number of younger Compact officers, several of whom had served under commanders present at Vantor Prime, began independently incorporating elements of Threshold Response's methodology into their own emergency planning, informally at first, then with growing institutional support as successive smaller-scale disasters demonstrated the approach's effectiveness even without full Compact endorsement. It would take another 18 years and 2 further high-casualty incidents before the Compact formally revised its emergency response doctrine along lines that, by then, no longer credited human methodology explicitly, though the officers who had actually studied under the revised framework knew exactly where its core principles had originated. Marcus Ilori, the field coordinator whose blunt exchange with Dorith on the third day became one of the most quoted moments of the entire operation, never sought out the attention the quote eventually brought him. He returned to active Threshold Response deployment within 4 months of Vantor Prime stabilization, declining every interview request that followed him for the rest of his career, and the one time a journalist finally cornered him at a public event years later and asked whether he regretted the harshness of his words to a Compact officer twice his formal rank, his answer was characteristically short. "I regret that I had to say it at all. I don't regret meaning every word." The fault line beneath what is now the new Corvin Hollow has not moved in 30 years. The specialists who once worked to hold that ground together have mostly retired, scattered across a dozen worlds they once arrived at as strangers and left, in more than one case, as permanent residents who never quite stopped feeling responsible for the places they had saved. Rosa Delgado, long past the age threshold response typically allows for active fieldwork, still keeps a small apartment in the rebuilt city, close enough to hear on quiet nights the low structural hum of a settlement that exists at all only because a handful of exhausted strangers once decided that a deadline nobody thought could be met was not, in fact, a reason to stop trying to meet it.